afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. It's definitely feeling like fall here in Philadelphia. Brisk in the mornings. So yeah, I'm starting to imagine the gray, bleary winter, but enjoying fall while it's here.
Yeah, we're getting a bit of that crispiness too here, just starting,
Yeah,
and which is okay. I mean, I kill some of the flies and mosquitoes. I'm all for that part.
yeah, and I think you mentioned in our last episode, it's a good time to get work done for sure.
It is, and I have been, which is nice.
Cool,
A little cooler, and yeah.
good. So we just finished the high holiday season in Judeo land in Judaica, and throughout it, there was a theme of belonging that we talked about in our last episode, but the other theme is forgiveness, and I've been thinking a lot about it because there's some nuance to it and some complexity to it. So one thing I've been thinking about is what does forgiveness really mean? Like when we forgive somebody, we might be letting go of a grudge that we're holding, but we might also be allowing them to participate in community in some way that we weren't previously, or um, we might be forgiving them but not their actions, or a friend of mine said once that forgiveness is like peeling an onion, not like onion peelings, but like peeling an onion,
Uh-huh.
where you might forgive somebody and then 5 years later you might realize you were still holding on to some piece of that and you need to let go of that also. Um, and then interestingly, there's this maybe metaphysical question where what involvement do we need from the other person in order to forgive them, and does that depend on circumstance? So Ray and I were talking about this, and she mentioned a rabbi who was who encountered a former Nazi on his deathbed, and the Nazi asked him for forgiveness, and he said he doesn't have the authority to do that because to speak on behalf of others who were harmed is was out of scope for him, and that seems quite different from the Christian version of forgiveness, or at least the Catholic version of forgiveness, where confession or atonement and repentance does the job, and that seems to be the case no matter the extent of the sin. So I think in Judaism, there might be this expectation that somebody has to seek forgiveness in order to get it. And and yeah, that might be different from group to group. So I guess there's a psychological component where letting go seems to be good for us. But then there's also this I guess religious spiritual component that gets a little murky. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about it, and maybe we could kick it around some.
Yeah. Um, I guess I think about this from a couple different angles. And it probably comes down to a definitional issue, the definition of terms. If we're talking about forgiveness as a purely internal state, then I have one set of thoughts about it. If our idea of forgiveness is this relational thing, then maybe there are some components uh, where the wronging party needs to participate in some way. That And then there's this question: well, what are we exactly expecting out of this forgiveness? You know, and I think the rabbi's probably correct when he says, I can't give you time off in hell if you've earned it. basically. And uh and I think that that at least points to the psychological aspect of it. The Buddha talks about his example is you're in a boat and another boat basically runs you over. And as you're there in the water, you're of course cursing whoever is steering the other boat because they're obviously doing this very irresponsibly and it's causing you suffering. But then as the other boat goes by, you glance over and you realize there's nobody on the other boat. The other boat is just operating as a pure mechanism of nature. The hand of Spinoza's God and no one else's. Just physics. Just this here at this time and you're there at that time and I think that there's that forgiveness falls naturally out of a certain metaphysical view if we're thinking about it purely as a psychological state in the component of the forgiver. Uh, and I think that it's a byproduct. It's not the main character, right? It's sort of realizing the givenness of things. It butts right up against that concept that we've mentioned before, amor fati, which is the love of one's fate, which comes, which is this, I would have to say a sort of a deep psychological condition that's arrived at through a lengthy process of coming to terms with one's own identity on some level and coming to terms with uh, that one is and the ways in which one is and the things that seem to be stuck on us in a unique way and not stuck on anybody else per se. And so that love of fate, is when we talked about Ibn El Arabi, there is this level of realization that he points to wherein even those suffering punishment realize that even this punishment is sweet because of the underlying sweetness of existence itself. And so, with that same idea, one can choose to be in the fate of outrageous slings and arrows, uh, sort of out of that place, um, which is different than forgiveness on the part of the forgiven and the social and relational implications. That internal psychological stuff I'm suggesting pushes it past something to do with you and the other person, the wronger, and having to do with you and the conditions of existence. So it's like you and metaphysics. But when we get into relational stuff and forgiveness as a sociological dynamic, then I think there are some questions again about what are we hoping to achieve by this forgiveness. And some of the better arguments say that if there is no genuine regret, no genuine seeking of forgiveness, that no internal state change has occurred. And if that internal state change hasn't occurred, then some lesson has yet to be transmitted. And then forgiveness in that case might be seen as losing the social leverage that could be motivating some sort of awareness shift. And so I certainly would be subject to hear some of those arguments from that side, as opposed to this idea that we're going to socially release people of responsibility just for our own internal behavior or our own internal condition. And that to me seems kind of selfish. and and a little like main character syndrome-y, uh, because our relations are happen in this whirlwind or this cyclotron of other human behaviors. And so, we do have some responsibility to that. And if somebody steps on my toe, I may have a responsibility to say, ouch.
Uh, there's an intersection between the individual psychological interpretations and the social collective ones, which is it might be beneficial for everybody. Let's say, hypothetically, it is beneficial for everybody to show kindness to somebody, even when um, they have done some wrong. And when we show kindness to somebody, what is the difference between that and forgiving them? That's one question. And then the other is, I'm glad you brought up Ibn al-Arabi, because I was thinking about him also, and taking the idea that no one can have a complete idea of God. And so we shouldn't have any judgment about any particular person's view of it or view of things. And notwithstanding that there might be a hierarchy of those views, but we don't know what the path is for someone to achieve greater awareness. And our non-judgment of their current condition might support their achievement of a state of greater awareness. And so it goes with forgiveness also, that when we forgive somebody, we also give them an opportunity to be repentant, right? There's like a chicken and an egg there potentially. Um, so yeah, so I guess the metaphysical question also is, when we release somebody, what are we releasing them from? Because when we just take the individual view, releasing them is releasing our own grudge, our own holding on, our own attachment, etc. But for the social component, w- what what does that release really mean? And is it different from showing them kindness?
Right. I think that this is one of the cases where traditionally we have employed a judge. And the job of a judge, as we have mentioned before, is to sort of bridge between this ideal world having to do with our ideas about justice and fairness and balance and all that, and to customize it and fit it into this situation. And it's interesting because I've been reading, which I trust is gonna come up more in our conversations. Uh, Hannah Arendt and her conversation on revolution, her book on revolution, and one of the things that she talks about there, which is very interesting to me, is the difference between compassion and pity. And that is that compassion, it has the word passion right in it. And it has this idea that it's a sort of an immediate response to a specific situation. Whereas pity, she calls a sentiment. And the idea of a sentiment is it's an attitude, but it's a longer term sort of a thing. It doesn't have quite the spontaneity implied. But for her, the real important difference is that it's an abstraction. We feel compassion for this person, plugging in a proper noun. But pity, we feel for things we don't capitalize: the masses, the poor, the downtrodden, the huddled masses yearning to be free, right? And that one of the things that she says, she attributes in comparing the French Revolution and the American Revolution, she contributes or attributes rather, the running off the rails of the French Revolution to this idea of pity. And, she says it's interesting. I was just looking at it. Let me see if it's still on here. Abstraction and impersonality. Pity is felt for the quote, suffering masses as an abstract entity, not for particular individuals. Arendt argues that this boundless, generalized emotion is insensitive to the reality of concrete persons and collapses a diverse plurality into a single unified group. This created an intolerant atmosphere that demanded unanimity and paved the way for the terror. The demands of the poor are limitless and insatiable, and they're rooted in the biological necessities of life rather than political principles. And as such, a revolution founded on the sentiment of pity has no internal check and can justify any level of violence in the name of the people. Unquote. I just thought this was a really apropos thing to mention, but it's exactly this point. Are we making general rules, or is the judge in this case someone who is going to have the role, I would say, of almost like a father, who does have some insight into the stages of growth that a person goes through and can make a distinction between a first time mistake that might warrant forgiveness and it may be when accompanied with signs of true regret and a wish to change, it can distinguish that from a repetitive situation that's obviously caught in a rut and obviously needs some sort of a stronger communication to potentially alter the situation, in which case personal forgiveness and societal forgiveness might be very different topics. And that's where we really need judges that are wise judges that understand that difference and that distinction and don't mistake the two. I think we're talking about this in a very generalized way, but these are very relevant questions to us now today, all across this country, and I'm sure others.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to kind of the polarization that we experience in this country politically. Um, if we imagine what healing that might look like, it's easy to prefer that it look like a bunch of people changing their minds and coming over to whatever side you want them to be on. Um, but the reality is, it if these kinds of social fractures can be healed, it probably entails raising the level of awareness, like the Einstein quote, right? Problems can't be solved at the level of awareness at which they were created. And
Both
the
individual and collective.
right.
Yeah.
And I wonder if forgiveness or kindness or the interrelationship between them is part of what that next level of awareness looks like. So kind of how do we transcend the differences and have a meal together, or whatever's meaningful.
Right. Well, there's a technology there, I would think.
Say more.
Well, my suspicion is that what's required in a case like that, at least once you get beyond a certain point, is the intercession of intermediaries. That, and that's where, our system, we have different gradations of how to solve these. It usually goes mediation, arbitration, litigation. Uh, You get a mediator who's got a skill set at working out difficult circumstances, who uses a protocol to go through that, who's seen in hopefully a non-emotionally charged up way by both parties so that they can actually go to both parties and say, "Look, this is the best you're gonna get." and not think that they're getting fed bad information from a party with a contrary interest to their own, uh, to arbitration, which is a little bit stricter and has different legal ramifications, all the way to litigation, where we put it in front of a judge. We argue very contentiously, both sides, both sides often employing experts for that purpose. And then a judge sits in the middle and says, this is what looks right. And so, so there is that question of, does the state have the right to grant forgiveness on the the behalf of injured parties who may not feel that such forgiveness is appropriate? So where does that power lie? As the rabbi's tale, uh, rightly questions. And then, this idea of a social contract sort of says, well, I'm going to give up my rights to personal, firsthand justice to the system for all the benefits that I and my kind and my family will reap from such a system.
I think forgiveness, it's interesting to pair that with justice, which we've talked about a couple of times, because there definitely can be situations in which they're linked. But I also see forgiveness as a way of um, doing an end around justice when the circumstances permit. So, or to deal with transgressions where justice isn't the um, a law doesn't have to be broken for forgiveness to be needed. Um, so so yeah, I guess my
Well,
I
and to
wonder
be
if we
clear,
can.
a law doesn't have to be broken for there to be two different pictures of what was thought to be a meeting of the minds,
Right.
and therefore a judge needing to come in and call the shots, just to be clear on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe let's drill down on the individual piece a little more, and then we can come back to the collective piece. So, what do you think is happening when we forgive somebody? What's happening internally? What does that release really mean?
I think that could mean different things to different people. Uh, I think that people of a very religious background might think that there's a future reward involved, as opposed to an instant karma kind of reward involved, which I mean to be by an automatic mechanism of reality, as opposed to a creator in a future, distant future. Uh, so, I mean, I think that what I trace it down to, if I was sitting across as a therapist from someone who is having trouble forgiving someone, I would immediately feel like there's likely to be a thread that could be found or picked up that went to uh, some mechanism or dynamic that made the injury, I almost want to say, symbolic. That, I saw somebody was referring to an interpretation of Job, the book of Job, and they were saying that one of the realizations that Job had was that the only real damages that we can suffer are damages to the soul, as opposed to pain suffered by the body, or by loss in the world, or by any of those eight winds. That none of those really attribute to soul damage. So, so what I would tend to think would be that often where forgiveness is a hurdle, probably one of these eight winds is at work. There's some attachment, there's some insecurity of the ego, there's some feeling that and I'm not when I say that, I'm not saying that that makes it necessarily inappropriate. There might be times when one's personhood is actually threatened, and one needs to act in an unforgiving manner until one feels that again the justice is served. And here's where it sort of backs into the justice conversation. I certainly am not going to forgive somebody on the social level if it's going to be writing a license for my continued abuse. So, so that's where I see forgiveness in on the relational aspect, at least, as a reward to be given as a positive reinforcement for movement in the right direction on the part of another. For myself, I think it's very similar to the conversation we had about anger. Uh, I don't want my grudge to generate dysfunction for me. I certainly don't want to pay any price larger than I've already paid for whatever damage I feel I've experienced. So, I personally have found that just like going into my cognitive model of the world and just sort of whiting out that person. I've jokingly called this writing them out of the book of life,
That's what it reminded
which,
me of. Yeah.
yeah, which sort of means, I don't think you've come around. I think if you had a chance to do the same thing, you'd do the same damn thing again, maybe even quicker, maybe even worse. So I feel a need to lay down the line and not have you participating in my reality, but I'm not going to move against you. And I think somebody's actions would have to be pretty overt to make me overtly move against them. The times I can think of that are very few and far between. And they probably a number of them would be cases like stopping someone from physically assaulting a third person. It's like, okay, this behavior, we're not going to discuss this. It's not about, I'm not going to, there's no role for me to forgive you in beating this other third party. So that means I'm going to have to take on the younger role of, maybe laying on of hands and
So to speak.
see what miracles can be wrought thereby. and And, like I say, the times that I've had to do that have been very few and very far between, and typically I was paid in an environment that was pretty charged up to where they knew something like this is likely to happen, so we're having to take steps to prevent it, you know? And then it's like it's overt. There's no judge needed to be consulted, right? These were self-evident truths of who was right and who was wrong and who. But as far as getting to the forgiveness part of that, it's like, do I carry this around and continue to pay an energetic price? Or what's the popular aphorism? Am I going to let this live rent free in my head? And I try to be very parsimonious about what I will let live rent free in my head. It's all gotta be paying some kind of rent as far as I'm concerned. It's all gotta be translating to something positive, or else I'm just running a negative loop. It's just like stabbing a hole in my own life raft. Why would you instead, you wanna be doing the opposite of that. So
So if you find yourself doing that and it's not forgiveness that stops it, what is it?
right, and that's the value of it, I guess. You gotta chase this down. What am I attached to? Was I insulted by this? Does it, like a Zen master was asked once, "What should you do if somebody spits in your face?" And I think one of the disciples answered, "Oh, just wipe it off. Don't worry about it." And the Zen master said, "No, just let it dry." Which was, apart from being a little gross, uh, I'm a fan of a Kleenex at the right time, myself personally, speaking for myself. But this was a way to convey how little he wanted the transgressions of others to tap out of his energy balance. Don't It's not worth the slightest bit of effort, is what he's telling us there. And I think on the personal level, that's exactly right. The you that's getting insulted, or the you that's feeling challenged, or the you that's getting slighted and all that, that shouldn't be taken personally. You should think about the nobody really at home in the boat, and so it's okay to let that go. On the other hand, you don't want to position yourself for continuous abuse. There's no point in that either. Uh, and so that's where I have always felt there's a sort of a,
Let's
that it's like the discussion of slaying demons. There's a hard path, a middle path, and an easy path, and you kind of make your call based on the circumstances. You got to call it when the coin is in the air.
um there's another version here. I mean, they're all adjacent, but when it's not that someone has wronged you directly, but they have, let's say, back to the political fracturing, they have a view of the world that, if it's allowed to fully express itself, tramples on your view of the world, which is surely a better one. Um, so, they haven't wronged you directly. They haven't directly put your life in jeopardy. But, you know, let's say they uh, really think taxes should be raised on you and people like you, or, so, but they think they're doing it for, they think that's a good idea for various reasons, whatever their reasons are.
Sure.
And then, you have to sit down to Thanksgiving dinner with them, or something like that. So so again, you could show them kindness at Thanksgiving dinner, but you might not forgive them their ignorance about the the path that they want to lead you down.
I mean, and the good thing is you don't really have to forgive them for their ignorance, because reality has this way with ignorance that I consider to be the biggest positive claim for philosophy. And that is that you really do like that. Like the saying about the inverse of this is, if you're not smart, you better be tough. And the inverse of that is that if you are smart, and every little bit, and I would change that maybe to wise, to every little nugget of wiseness that you can get, you will suffer less. And so this is almost a translation of that. Foolishness is its own reward and its own punishment.
I've heard that about arrogance too.
Yeah, but I mean, I think as far as the people who are uh, proclaiming a different doctrine, well, that's where the marketplace of ideas and the First Amendment and free speech and eloquence, and there are still evil rhetoricians out there. And that's what I would tell them, maybe. Get behind me, evil rhetorician. you know, but really what it comes down to it is, a friend of mine when I was in college wrote this song that I really liked called Word Dance. And what the song talked about was, there are the words and then there's the dance behind them. And that what's really going on, a lot of the communication is happening on the level of the dance behind the words. And so how I'm going to react to anything, particularly verbal, is going to depend on the dance behind the words. Uh, your friends can say things to you that if other people said it to you, you'd know they meant it a different way and they'd be fighting words. And, so just reading the dialogue doesn't always translate the dance behind the words. And so I would say that forgiveness isn't just in the words, it's in part of the dance too, if we're talking about it in that relational aspect. Uh, you know, if we're talking about it in its own personal aspect, then you should dance as if no one's looking, as the saying goes. But in its relational aspect, you have to dance with the people that you're dancing
That brung
with.
you.
The dance with the people that brung you, and you're gonna have to dance to the music that's playing. And if you're find yourself in a mosh pit, then keep your eyes open, your wits about you, you know. So I mean, a lot of that is sort of tangled up in there with the social dance that's going on. And uh uh often the words don't really convey the energy. That's why I'm kind of sad that we only get the dialogues of Plato and we never got the videos. Apparently the videos were all lost. And so we don't get to read any of those in between the lines
They're
kind of
still in the
things.
cave.
Apparently, yeah. And and they're probably all on floppy or something old anyway,
Yeah,
so
yeah. So, I I I started thinking about what the infinity in the other, might say about forgiveness. Like, in order to experience the other and not totalize them, is it something akin to forgiveness that we have to be open to in order to really see the infinity in others?
I think it's just exactly the same as that question about amor fati. You have to have forgiven the universe for putting you here and making you look like this to whatever degree that's appropriate. And that part of that is what happens to you. And it isn't that you're not involved, and this is where we get into that we've backed our way into the conversation about free will, of which we shall have a number more in the future. And so it's like what people love to point out is that, well, you never have free will because there's every different kind of thing wanking on you from every direction. So that it's just a question of what's wanking on you. Like, yeah, but you are also the one that's deciding which of these things to react to and which not to, which wanking is working. And there might be some implication that, well, the order of wankage is absolute, and so there's a calculus of wankery that that just forces free will out of the picture again, right? But I would say no. I would say that, there's this idea that whirlwinds, they're unpredictable. That a vortex has a certain amount of unpredictableness. And I would say that the human consciousness is never not in the center of a constant vortex. And the predictability of which of these flying stimuli and influences hits when and where and in which order and what final outcome comes out of the human soul and its interaction with those things, I think there's absolutely plenty of room for free will in there. Not to say that those things don't have their influences, but we obviously, when you're playing pool, you have the free will to choose between hitting the blue ball or the red ball. Obviously, you don't have the free will to choose a ball that's not on the table, right? Um, so, uh, so I do think that there's something involved with that. Uh, and you know, I mean, the other humans and the human forgiveness, they're free will systems also, and that's part of that infinity. That's one of the elements of that infinity is is the uncatchableness of that. And so, well, this is just another face on the total uncatchableness of the total infinity of your existence. And it's just another thing going, "Can't totalize me," you know, "Neener, neener." And that whether the universe is deterministic or not, I don't think it changes your hand that much.
Hmm.
I think that it's as good as indeterminate because of that whirlwind function, because of the unpredictability of what's going to happen when you step out the door tomorrow. You know, you don't know you're not going to be like our hero, Arthur Dent, and find that in 24 hours, everything is different. But probably you'll go out and you'll get the mail and come in and have your cup of coffee and have breakfast.
No intergalactic highway being built through your yard and also Earth.
Typically not. Although the fact that we can't say that as a hard and fast rule is what keeps the ball in the air.
Yeah,
Fair to say.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as far as forgiveness is concerned, I think that it happens within this big metaphysical context of how you understand life. And if you believe, as I do, that the purpose of life is the evolution of consciousness, then one would hopefully use the tool of forgiveness in the service of the ultimate evolution of consciousness of yourself and everybody else, including those to be forgiven or not forgiven. That's the way I would plug it into the hierarchy. Now, if you might be inclined to forgive people just because you don't like confrontation and you don't, you know, and it could be you're forgiving them out of weakness because you can't stand up for yourself. And this is you know, another in a
I might
long
argue
line of abuses.
that's not actually forgiveness.
Yeah, no, I would say that. Yeah, yeah. But if that's what's masquerading, you need to unmask that and you need to fix what's broken. And that's really maybe the deepest lesson is look into the situation and with doing with what is within your power, fix what's broken. And obviously, if we're in a condition where forgiveness is necessary, something's broken. It's not always typically within our power to fix it, but it might be within our power to use our behavior to point to it so that in the etiology of the problem, it gets closer to being seen and correctly decoded and solved. So I
Yeah,
think
you
that's the
mentioned the 8 wins earlier as a diagnostic tool for what might be standing in the way of our own letting go. And I yeah, I had this funny experience. I mean, it's funny in hindsight, 20 years later. But you remember my dog was shot because she ran over to your house and hid on your couch until I came and got her. She survived.
right, right.
And I didn't know, I think for a couple of years who had shot my dog. And then the person who did it w- admitted it and was really upset about it. And in the moment, I felt forgiveness and told them I forgave them. And then like 15 minutes later, I was like, wait a minute. I don't know if I want to let go of that so easy. And um, I think that was the, your comment earlier about this goes to identity, I think is also at the bedrock of what forgiveness really is, right? Along the
Yeah,
lines of if you ask yourself, who am I? You keep getting deeper and deeper layers, much like peeling the onion of forgiveness. And And I don't have a better answer for why I wanted to hold on to it other than I had identified with this wrong. And yeah, and so I guess I'm curious about what um
Identified with is another word for attachment,
yeah,
just to point out, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Somehow it had become symbolic.
Right. Um
Yeah.
well, that's an interesting definition of attachment, if that's what that was. That we make symbols of things um as we identify with them. They're no longer just the thing, but when they become part of us, they also become symbolic. Well, that's a
They
really
become vehicles
interesting.
for our mental, uh, loading up,
Yeah.
you might say, yeah. No, and that becomes important to realize when that's happening to the degree that we can. This is one of the things that pretty universally, it seems like all these great philosophers have been urging us to do, to see things. For Spinoza, it was subspecie aeternitatis. For uh, uh, other, I'm trying to think of specifics, but, this idea of a 30 without desire was Lao Tzu, right? Or the 30,000-foot view so that we don't get triggered, or the phenomenologists, we want to look using bracketing so that our particularities are filtered out of it somehow, or we're born with the foot nailed down, we want to pull the nail up because somehow that broadens our picture and our perspective. So, right there are all these different models of the evolution of consciousness. It's better to think about it or see it this way than this way, or it's bigger to think about it this way than this way. And that on some level, you'll be better served by seeing it bigger rather than seeing it smaller. I mean, that's the implication there. And I think this is parallel to the conversation that we had with Stephen Nadler in places, which I just re-listened to do the show notes. And this is on the general topic of, does philosophy, get us closer to what we want and farther from the things we don't want? And and all the differences, and this is another, as you know, one of my banjo songs, my one string banjo songs, is that yes, we get hypnotized by all the differences in philosophers, but the real big important lessons they all seem to agree on, or they agree on the big pieces of, or there's very similar feelings about the pieces in the way they, and yeah, there's differences, but we can generalize those and get some very good counsel out of it. Like uh, uh, there's a rock and roll reference in here somewhere. Rehumanize yourself. If we go in the reggae direction, you know that there are higher levels of our humanity that we can express, and that's where we should be going. That the perfect man of Ibn al Arabi, the 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 best partner of heaven and earth for the Taoists, the human capacity for the the creation in general to experience itself at the highest level fulfilled. That's the urging, that all they have slightly different pictures, they have slightly different languages. Well, the worldview that they all tend to push us up towards all seem to have very similar ideas about forgiveness. And that is, that don't get sucked down into the little particularities that will get you into sectarian tangle ups, but move to the bigger, the universal. This is actually the idea of the word Catholic, right? It's a universal, trying to move to a universal idea. And that's what often it gets misunderstood and turns into evangelicalism, and not just in the part of Christianity, but in all religions and a lot of different fragments of religions. It turns into "we're right." And what it was originally, or the intent of it from way up on top, is that everybody fulfill their what it is to be them. as intended by the universe. And it seems to be that forgiveness is somewhere along that ladder as the natural byproduct of that change of perspective, of that getting the big picture. The particularities don't matter as much. They get lost in our picture of the coastline of Norway as we zoom out. And that we're somehow in this case better served by that because we're understanding the source of life, to use Lao Tzu's model, seeing things without desire, without that particularity. Um, because remember, the things that are typically the topic of things that are to be forgiven are very much things that happen to us in our seat at the record player that has its particularities of this and that back and forth. Uh, and so it tends to lock down in that lower dimension rather than when we move up, we tend to lose the particularity that caused the feeling of injury, that caused the need for forgiveness or punishment or justice. That all kind of gets left down with those lower dimensions in back and forth land, as opposed to in the it's all one big circle, higher dimensional perspective. So that's why I say it isn't that forgiveness was the purpose, it's that forgiveness was the result, along with all the other results of this more
The
illuminated
perspective change.
consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why, in times, even when I was younger, there were times when I had, you know, very genuine gripes against people, which I probably could have even taken legal action on if had I been inclined to things like that. And I very intentionally did nothing because I knew they were going to reap the rewards of that foolishness, particularly if there was nothing to instill in them the instinct to pump the brakes. Like if I were to try to take my maybe that would be a wake up call. And I so wanted them to suffer for their injustice. I thought, let them go on to their inevitable demise and let them gather as much interest as they deserve, you know. And that's kind of like maybe the little bit of emotional payback that we can take from that idea that punishment belongs to the Lord, as they like to say. Uh, that foolishness brings its own fruit. It plants its own seeds, it grows its own tree. And that's why I've often like I've literally had people come just seething for revenge and told them, "No, forget about it. Turn your back, leave, let that person's tentacles of negativity fall on someone else who has the karma to be standing there when it happens, but don't engage, don't engage, don't engage." They ended up in jail for, longer than a year, and then coming back telling me, "Oh, I so wish that I had listened to you." And that's because black seeds grow, evil. What is it? There's a whole poetic illusion there that's slipping my mind there that has to do with the black flowers of evil that come when you plant these seeds of malice, and that there is a great that is the payback. If you're wise enough to step back, to push back from the table, you will save yourself the inevitable pains and costs of not doing so. There's really great rewards to be reaped in the sense of not having certain negative repercussions. And this is where this idea of karma comes in. Well, what pulled me into where I had to get payback, I had to get revenge. Well, that was the thing I carried inside of me. That didn't happen when the person injured me. I had that inside of me. And then when they come and they trigger that, now I'm going to be the one that experiences the fruits of that karma. Maybe they will too, based on their input, but really, they become an excuse for me to plant my own seeds and reap my own harvest of whatever negativity I carried and didn't purge until it blossomed, you know. So forgiveness is tangled up with that. In that sense, forgiveness can be a purging ourself of these seeds of malice that
Yeah.
ultimately spring into these, black pumpkins.
Yeah, there's a little taxonomy there because the implication there, or the simplistic implication, is that forgiveness is really an essential component of keeping the psyche clear enough to for attainment to be possible. And then the subtlety, to bring back some of your earlier comments, that um, somebody who's actively misbehaving and or is unrepentant may not merit forgiveness, and in fact, forgiving them might just be taken as permission to continue behaving the way that they are.
Might be
So
irresponsible to encourage them.
yeah, it really brings out the the internal versus relational differences here, and I think forgiveness is actually a few different things. I
Well, you
wonder
remember
if
in our conversation about anger, I told you about the guy who kinda had the anger for its effect, but he wasn't somebody that went around flushed red who was about to pop off in anger all the time, and that's why, literally nanoseconds after he screamed at these kids, he looked at me cold as a cucumber and said, "If I don't do that, they won't listen." Well, I think that's the kind of relationship that we might need to have with the impulse to not forgive. We might need to separate ourselves from that and say, well, okay, I realize this was a boat without a rudder or without a captain, but I also know that if I do this right, maybe I can help alter the course or wake up the captain who's asleep in the bottom of the boat. But if I'm doing this for the right reasons. This is not because I'm going to make them pay. This is because I'm looking like a judge with a paternalist instinct to say, "Oh, my child has gone astray here, and I want to administer the curative to get things back on the true and straight and narrow, so that everybody has the most fulfillment and positive outcome." That's very different than me operating out of the seed of unforgiveness. Maybe that's more of a fruitful topic than just forgiveness. As long as you're not harboring the seeds of unforgiveness, then whether you forgive or not, it might be free to serve a relational purpose for educational purposes,
yeah, I think
if that
that's a
makes
win.
sense.
I think
Yeah.
that's a distinction I can take away from this conversation and get some wood on the ball with. That's interesting. I'm captivated by the idea that came up a little while ago about when we become identified with something or attached to something, we're making a symbol of it, and it it just makes me, it puts symbols in a location on the cognitive model map for me in a little bit of a different way than it had before. Like I've thought of symbols as like a universe that kind of exists as a layer on the physical universe and on the um, I guess on the physical universe, really, because it either includes or intersects with the spiritual universe and the emotional universe and all the non-physical ways of describing reality. But but that this makes it it gives me an image of symbols existing in the self in a different way, and those symbols in the self relating to the symbols that are out there at large. Like I have to believe that there are cultural reinforcements to the idea of identifying with something. And so there's like
Yep.
collective attachment to symbols that we ride in on when we identify with symbols ourselves. I'm just wondering if there like that might just be a whole episode.
Well, and the emotional attachment to those symbols sort of backs into the conversation about social contagions and and Hannah Arendt's point about how things run off the track when they get associated with these sort of generic, free floating,
Totalizing.
um,
Yeah.
totalizing kind of behaviors. Yeah. And that this is like historical, which we'll get into someday when we talk about Hannah Arendt full on. Uh, one of it's very illuminating to me about the psychological dynamics writ large that are based on metaphysical assumptions about life and how life should be and how other people should behave and what expectations are appropriate for me to put on other people. And we've touched on a lot of these different things, but it's becoming very relevant now that we're seeing so much strife in the body politic trying to resolve its own thoughts. Not that they're ever resolved, but that there's a collective cooking, metabolizing process that's never happened before, like it's happening now because of this technology. Um, that it's not just a game changer. It's like it redefines the way that the game happens somehow because of this technological impact. So it's an interesting thing, and I feel like a lot of these topics they've been with us forever. I mean, we know because we sometimes go back to quoting people from 350 BC in talking about these topics, but we're now collectively processing them in a different way.
Mm.
And that's why I think it's important now to understand the difference between compassion and pity, because we need to see a lot more compassion and a lot less pity.
There's a kind of business meme, the kind of thing you see on LinkedIn all the time if you spend any time there. I trust you don't.
It's true.
Nor should you.
You trust well.
Um, but it's like for HR people, right? To remind the rest of us what's the difference between being nice and being kind, and like nice is
Mm,
basically the way you described forgiving out of weakness,
mm,
or which isn't real forgiveness, right? But we go along to get along. We violate our own boundaries or an organization's boundaries in order to make space for bullies. That
right.
sort of thing is nice. Whereas kind is
Yeah.
holding boundaries and holding people accountable and that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
distinction you're making reminds me of that. Pity and compassion
Right.
is somewhat analogous to nice and kind.
Yeah. You know the original meaning of the word nice? The original meaning, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to take a guess, so let's
Uh-huh.
save
Yeah,
time.
no, go for it.
Well, I was thinking of niceties, right? Where it's more, it's like a convenience, but that was my guess.
Yeah, no, and I'll check and I'll make sure, and if I'm wrong, I'll put it in the show notes, which on the few occasions that has happened, I have done that. So that's why people should always check the show notes because maybe I've, put Antarctica up in the north or quoted Marcus Aurelius or something when it was really Epictetus. We don't want to let that kind of thing slide. Uh, but I think the original association with nice was accurate,
Oh,
as in fine, like a micrometer could be nice,
huh,
but your Aunt Millie, not so much.
uh-huh.
And of course, it's all completely changed, and I suspect that niceties has come post that change.
Aunt Millie,
Um,
that bitch.
That exactly, I know. Well, all those pit bulls and everything, it's too much. It's too much.
All right, maybe we'll leave it there for now. I think this symbols topic is coming back, but, we'll save that for another
Yeah.
time.
Well, that's what I wanted to point out. That's my other thought about symbols that made me think of it, and that is that it's this intimate part of meaning making. It's like the basic mechanism of meaning making is translating from specific events into this world of meaning. And we speak about that glowingly, but one of the things that NLP drilled down on, neuro linguistic programming, was how we make mistakes in that process of meaning making and of symbolizing things to mean other things, that are the world we inhabit. That cognitive model world gets impoverished by, if our meaning if our symbology is sloppy or inaccurate or happens unconsciously, and of course it always happens to some degree unconsciously, but we need to go through this process of rooting it out to see that we're not taking any wooden nickels. And that's, I think, largely part of the phenomenologist's great insight, was that we have to look at how we look. We need to have that meta self-reflexive thing, because without that mere polishing, we're not going to get anything but our own craziness back in our face.
Mhm.
And that's definitely valid, um, so yeah, I think that's my last 2 cents on that
Cool.
for
Thank
today.
Yeah, yeah. To be continued.
To be continued.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.